Hey there, and welcome to this deep dive exploring faith, reason, and the reality of God.
Sounds deep.
It is. Our guide for this journey is Anthony L. Little's book, Faith, Reason, and the Reality of God, published back in 1998.
A little bit of a throwback.
Yeah, 1998. You ready to tackle some big questions about belief science and the search for truth?
Absolutely. Little really digs into the tension between traditional religious beliefs and those modern scientific discoveries.
I'm intrigued already.
It's a good one.
So where do we even start unpacking all of this?
Well, Little challenges the idea that blind faith is exclusive to religion right off the bat.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he argues that even science can cling to theories despite gaps in the data.
That's interesting because science is all about testing and observation.
It is.
So does he give any examples?
He does. He uses evolution as a prime example.
Okay.
While it's presented as a hard fact.
All right.
He points out that there's a lack of clear evidence for how new species actually arise through gradual changes.
Yeah.
What he calls stepwise adaptation.
So he's not rejecting evolution outright,
Not at all.
but rather encouraging a more critical look at its missing pieces.
Precisely.
I like it.
He wants us to think for ourselves.
Yes.
Instead of just accepting because it's the prevailing scientific view.
Right.
And to illustrate this,
Yeah.
he uses this analogy about a water creature called a femur.
A femur.
A femur encountering a land creature with legs for the first time.
Okay.
The femur can't comprehend how, if evolution is about small, gradual changes,
Yeah.
these legs could have just popped up out of nowhere. Like,
Yeah.
where did they come from?
Yeah. That makes sense.
That's his point.
So it's a way to highlight those jumps in evolution that we don't fully understand yet.
Exactly.
Like
It makes you think a little bit more critically about it.
Does Little address other perspectives on the origins of life, like creationism?
Yes, he touches on that as well.
Okay.
He explores the creationist perspective, which argues for a much younger Earth,
Okay.
only about 10,000 years old, based on things like calculations of helium in the atmosphere and the Earth's magnetic decay.
Interesting.
That's very different.
Yeah, very different from the evolutionary timeline.
Very much so.
Okay, so Little's encouraging us to consider different viewpoints and not just accept the status quo.
Absolutely.
I like it.
And that's what makes this book so interesting.
So what's next on this deep dive into faith and reason?
Well, from the age of the Earth, Little takes us to the origins of the universe itself,
Okay.
specifically the Big Bang Theory.
All right.
He points out this paradox that many scientists grapple with,
Okay.
which is what caused this initial event that supposedly started everything.
Yeah, that's a question I've thought about a lot.
Yeah,
If the Big Bang created the universe, what created the Big Bang?
exactly. And Little highlights how science tries to sidestep this question by suggesting that the principle of cause and effect
Right.
might not apply to the Big Bang.
Interesting.
They say time and space began with the Big Bang, so there's no before to consider.
Yeah. But doesn't that feel like avoiding the question rather than answering it?
It does to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Even some prominent scientists like Stephen Hawking
Oh, wow.
admitted that this idea of a universe popping into existence without a cause was a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah.
So Little suggests that maybe this resistance stems from a subconscious aversion to the idea of a creator.
Okay.
Or a force beyond our current scientific understanding.
So he's implying that even in science, there can be a bias towards explanations that fit within our existing frameworks.
Yes, and this ties back to his earlier point about the potential for dogma in science.
Right.
You know, he's not saying science is wrong,
Right.
but he is encouraging us to be aware of its limitations
Okay.
and be open to the possibility that there might be more to the story than we currently grasp.
That's a really interesting perspective. It seems like he's advocating for a more nuanced view of both science and religion, recognizing their strengths and weaknesses.
Yes, and this is just the beginning.
Right.
Now the book delves into the potential dangers of blind faith.
Ooh. Specifically within a religious context.
I have a feeling this is where things might get a little controversial.
Potentially.
Yeah.
But Little isn't dismissing the value of faith entirely.
Okay.
He acknowledges that it can offer comfort, hope, and a sense of purpose.
Right.
But he cautions that unquestioning faith without the application of reason can distort our perception of reality and lead us to accept things that might not be true.
So it's about finding a balance between faith and critical thinking.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And to illustrate this point, he brings up some real-world examples.
Okay.
He discusses the case of Hal Lindsey, author of The Late Great Planet Earth,
Okay.
who made a series of very specific predictions about the future.
Okay.
based on his interpretation of biblical prophecy.
Oh, wow.
And as Little points out, none of those predictions actually came to pass.
So that's a pretty clear example of how relying solely on faith without considering other perspectives or evidence can lead to misguided beliefs.
Yes, it can happen.
I think we all fall into that trap sometimes. We do.
Yeah.
He also mentions this woman who claimed that divine healing could only occur within Christianity.
Wow.
And dismissing all other healing claims as counterfeit. But when pressed for evidence to support her belief, she admitted it was based on anecdotal stories.
Oh, wow.
Rather than any objective examination.
It's a good reminder that we should always be willing to question our beliefs, especially when they're based on hearsay or personal experiences.
Yes, because those can be very subjective.
Yeah, exactly.
And Little ties this back to the dangers of confusing tradition and association with actual truth. He uses the example of the Catholic belief that touching the statue of St. Peter will lead to answered prayers.
Okay.
It makes you wonder how many of our beliefs are based on what we've been told or what's familiar,
Right.
rather than on genuine evidence or personal understanding.
It's a powerful reminder that we need to be critical thinkers, even when it comes to our own deeply held beliefs.
Right. And that leads us to one of the most thought-provoking sections of the book.
Okay, let's hear it.
Little's exploration of the Bible itself.
Okay, I have a feeling this is where things are really going to get interesting. What does Little say about the Bible?
He makes a bold claim stating that the belief in the New Testament as the literal Word of God is based solely on tradition and association.
Really?
Not on anything actually stated within the New Testament itself.
That's a pretty controversial statement,
For sure.
especially for those who consider the Bible to be divinely inspired.
Very much, though.
Does he provide any evidence to support this claim?
He does. He delves into the origins of the New Testament,
Okay.
explaining that it wasn't handed down as a complete text,
Right.
but rather compiled from various sources
Yeah.
long after Jesus' death. It was a human process of collecting and editing these writings.
I see.
And he argues that understanding this human element is crucial to interpreting the text.
So he's not saying the Bible is without value,
No, not at all.
but that we need to understand its historical and human context.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And to illustrate this point,
Yeah. He points out some of the discrepancies that exist between the different Gospels.
oh, really?
For example, there are conflicting accounts of whether Jesus allowed his disciples to take a staff with them on their journey.
Oh, wow.
In Matthew and Luke, they're explicitly forbidden. But in Mark, they're allowed to take one.
Those seem like minor details.
They might seem minor, but they raise questions about the idea of biblical inerrancy,
What's that?
the belief that the Bible is perfect and without error.
Oh.
If it truly is the literal Word of God, why would there be these inconsistencies?
I see. So it challenges that notion of the Bible as a single, unified, and perfectly consistent text.
Exactly.
Does he address any other differences between the Gospels?
He does. He points out that the Gospel of John, which was written later,
Okay.
presents a slightly different picture of Jesus.
Okay.
In John's Gospel, Jesus focuses more on salvation through faith, which aligns more with the teachings of Paul, who came after Jesus.
I see.
So it's like we're seeing the evolution of Christian thought reflected in the different Gospels.
Exactly. And Little suggests that the Gospel of John being written later might have been influenced by the already established doctrines of Paul, which
Right.
were gaining popularity at the time.
Makes sense.
Right.
It highlights how the Bible, like any historical document, was shaped by the time and context in which it was written.
Exactly. And that's a key point Little wants us to grasp.
Yeah.
He's urging us to read the Bible with a critical eye,
Yes.
recognizing its historical and human elements,
Yeah.
rather than blindly accepting it as a divinely dictated and perfectly consistent text.
It's fascinating. We've covered so much ground already.
We have, from the origins of the universe to the complexities of the Bible.
What other thought-provoking ideas does Little explore in this book?
Well, next he tackles the question of who Jesus really was, both as a historical figure and as the Christ figure revered in Christian tradition.
Okay.
And he doesn't shy away from challenging some deeply held beliefs about Jesus and his teachings.
I can't wait to hear more about that.
It's a good one. Picking up where we left off, Little dives into the figure of Jesus, and he really encourages us to separate the historical Jesus, the man who walked the earth, from the Christ figure that evolved through religious tradition.
That sounds like a difficult distinction to make. How does he approach that?
He points out that many of the stories about Jesus, especially those surrounding his birth and miracles, bear striking similarities to pre-existing myths and legends from other cultures.
So he's suggesting that some of those miraculous elements might have been added later to make the story resonate more with people familiar with those older narratives.
Exactly. It's a bit like how different cultures have their own flood myths,
Right.
or stories of dying and rising gods.
Yeah.
These common threads suggest that some elements of Jesus' story, as presented in the Gospels, might be more symbolic or allegorical than literal historical accounts.
That's fascinating. It makes you wonder what the core of Jesus's message really was stripped of those later embellishments.
And that's precisely what Little tries to uncover. He argues that at its heart, Jesus' message was actually quite simple and profound.
Okay.
A message of God's unconditional love.
Okay.
And the importance of living a life of compassion and forgiveness.
It's interesting that he focuses on those core teachings, especially since there are other parts of the Bible, both Old and New Testament, that seem to focus on judgment, punishment, and a more conditional kind of love.
You're right. And Little acknowledges that tension within the Bible itself.
Okay.
He contrasts those God-centered teachings of love and compassion with those that he sees as reflecting more human ego
Okay.
and desires for power and control.
So he's encouraging us to read the Bible with discernment, to identify those teachings that resonate with our deepest understanding of a loving God.
Exactly. He's
Yeah.
urging us to use our own reason and intuition alongside faith to determine which parts of the Bible hold the most truth and relevance for us today.
Okay, so we've talked about Little's approach to the Bible and his interpretation of Jesus's teachings. What other key themes does he explore in the book?
Well, he delves into the history of the church itself.
Okay. And this is where his critique gets quite sharp.
Okay.
He argues that the church, throughout its history, has often strayed from those core teachings of love and compassion
Okay.
that he attributes to Jesus.
What are some of the examples he gives?
He highlights instances where the church, instead of embracing truth and open dialogue, has actively suppressed information or persecuted those who challenged its authority.
That's a pretty serious accusation. What specific events does he point to?
He discusses the Dead Sea Scrolls scandal,
Oh, yeah.
which involved the discovery of ancient biblical texts that had been hidden for centuries.
Right.
These scrolls offered alternative perspectives on early Christian beliefs,
Okay.
but access to them was tightly controlled by a small group of scholars,
Okay.
primarily Catholic. And many accused them of deliberately suppressing information that contradicted traditional church doctrines.
That sounds like an attempt to control the narrative and maintain power, which doesn't seem very aligned with the message of love and humility that Jesus preached. Exactly. And Little argues that this pattern of suppressing dissenting voices and clinging to power has repeated itself throughout church history.
Wow.
He brings up the Inquisition,
Right.
a period marked by brutal persecution of those deemed heretical by the church.
The Inquisition is a pretty dark chapter in history. It's hard to reconcile those actions with the idea of a loving and compassionate God.
It is, and Little argues that these actions stem from a dangerous conflation of ancient ignorance and prejudice with divine authority. He points to instances where biblical passages, often taken out of context, have been used to justify violence, discrimination, and oppression.
It's a reminder that the Bible, like any text, can be interpreted in different ways.
For sure.
And those interpretations can be used for good or for ill.
Precisely. And Little challenges us to be aware of how those interpretations can be shaped by power dynamics, cultural biases, and even personal agendas.
So he's not just critiquing historical events, but also highlighting how these patterns of intolerance and the misuse of religious authority can manifest in our own time.
Exactly. He brings up modern examples like the Christian identity movement,
Okay.
a white supremacist group that twists biblical interpretations to justify its racist ideology.
That's a disturbing example of how religious beliefs can be distorted to serve harmful ends.
It is, and he also discusses more mainstream attempts to legislate morality based on narrow interpretations of the Bible,
Like what?
such as efforts to restrict abortion access or same-sex marriage.
So he's making a connection between those historical examples of religious intolerance and the ways in which those same attitudes can play out in contemporary society.
Yes, he's urging us to recognize that those patterns of exclusion and judgment, even when masked as religious piety, ultimately contradict the core message of love and acceptance that he believes Jesus embodied.
It's a powerful reminder that we need to be critical thinkers, not just about the information we encounter, but also about the motivations and agendas behind those who present that information, especially when it comes to matters of faith and religion. So with all of this critique of traditional religion, does Little offer any alternative vision, a more positive or hopeful way of relating to God and spirituality?
He does. In the later chapters, he shifts from critique to a more constructive approach, offering a vision of God that he believes aligns more closely with those core teachings of love and compassion that he identifies in the Gospels.
I'm curious to hear more about that. What does he say about God?
He introduces the concept of God as the eternal parent, a term that emphasizes unconditional love, nurturing, and a desire for our growth and well-being.
Okay.
He suggests that our relationship with God is not about earning our way into heaven through obedience or good deeds, but rather about experiencing life as a journey of spiritual development, guided and supported by a loving parent.
That's a very different image than the one often presented of a judgmental God who punishes those who disobey it. Feels much more aligned with the message of love and forgiveness that Jesus taught.
Exactly. And this vision of God as the eternal parent has some interesting implications for how we understand our purpose in life.
Okay, how so?
Little suggests that our earthly existence is not a test to pass or fail, but rather a training ground for spiritual growth.
I like that.
It's about learning, evolving, and becoming more and more like our divine parent.
I love that analogy of life as a training ground. It implies that challenges and even mistakes are opportunities for learning and growth, rather than something to be feared or punished for.
Yes, and it shifts the focus from trying to earn God's approval to simply embracing the journey and trusting that we are loved and supported unconditionally every step of the way.
That's a much more hopeful and empowering perspective. It takes some of the pressure off, doesn't it? So if we're not here to earn our way into heaven, what is our purpose, according to Little?
He suggests that our ultimate purpose is to grow in love, understanding, and compassion, to develop our capacity for these qualities and to express them in the world through our thoughts, words, and actions.
That's beautiful. It aligns with the idea of seeing ourselves as God's children, inheritors of those divine qualities, rather than just flawed creations in need of constant redemption.
Exactly. And it connects to another important theme in the book, the idea of divine inspiration.
How does he approach that concept?
He argues that divine inspiration isn't some kind of magical download of information, but rather a gradual unfolding of truth that becomes accessible to us as we grow and evolve. It's like we become more receptive to that inspiration as we cultivate our capacity for love, compassion, and understanding.
So it's not about waiting for some kind of thunderbolt of revelation,
right?
But about actively cultivating those qualities that allow us to connect with the divine within and around us.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that this process of spiritual growth is ongoing. It's a journey, not a destination.
Great.
There's always more to learn, more to experience, and more to discover about ourselves, the world, and the nature of God.
This is such a rich and thought-provoking conversation. We've covered so much ground.
We have.
But I feel like we've only scratched the surface of Little's ideas.
There's a lot.
What other key takeaways does he leave us with?
Well, he delves into the concept of free will and how it relates to our spiritual growth. He suggests that God gave us free will not to punish us for making the wrong choices, but rather to allow us to learn and evolve through our experiences, both positive and negative.
So it's about embracing the full spectrum of human experience with all its ups and downs as opportunities for growth and understanding.
Yes, he emphasizes that even our mistakes, our stumbles, and our failures can be valuable learning experiences. They can help us to develop compassion, empathy, and a deeper understanding of ourselves and others.
That's a really liberating perspective. It takes the pressure off the idea of needing to be perfect and encourages us to see even our imperfections as part of our spiritual journey.
Exactly, and it connects to his critique of the traditional concept of hell as eternal punishment. He argues that the idea of a loving God condemning people to eternal torment for their actions in this brief lifetime simply doesn't make sense.
It doesn't seem very aligned with the idea of God as the eternal parent who loves and supports us unconditionally.
Right, and Little suggests that this idea of hell is more a reflection of human concepts of justice and retribution than a true representation of God's nature.
So what does he propose as an alternative to the traditional view of heaven and hell?
He doesn't offer specific details about the afterlife, but he emphasizes that our focus should be on living this life to the fullest, cultivating our spiritual growth, and expressing those divine qualities of love, compassion, and understanding in the world. He suggests that by doing so, we naturally align ourselves with the will of God. regardless of what form the afterlife might take.
That's a really empowering message. It puts the emphasis on our actions in this life rather than on trying to earn our way into heaven or avoid hell.
Yeah. Exactly, and it connects to another powerful theme in the book, the idea that we are all interconnected. If we are all children of the same divine parent, then we are all part of one big spiritual family.
That's a beautiful thought. It challenges those us versus them mentalities that have caused so much division and conflict throughout history.
It does, and Little argues that true spiritual growth requires us to move beyond those artificial boundaries and to recognize the inherent worth and dignity of every human being.
It's about seeing the face of God in everyone we meet, regardless of their background beliefs or choices.
And it's about embracing the responsibility that comes with that recognition.
Okay.
If we are all connected, then the well-being of each individual impacts the well-being of the whole.
It's a call to action, isn't it?
It is.
A call to live our lives in a way that reflects our understanding of our interconnectedness and our shared divine heritage.
Exactly. The book challenges us to let go of those old patterns of judgment, condemnation, and separation, and to embrace a more expansive and compassionate way of being in the world.
This has been such an insightful exploration. Little covers so much ground in this book, from challenging traditional religious beliefs to offering a more hopeful and inclusive vision of spirituality. It's a lot to process.
It is.
But I feel like I've gained some valuable insights.
Me too. And while we've explored many of the key themes in the book, Little offers even more food for thought in his concluding chapters.
Okay, so what's next on this deep dive? What other thought-provoking ideas does he leave us with?
Well, he delves into how we can practically apply these concepts to our daily lives, offering suggestions for cultivating spiritual growth, connecting more deeply with God, and expressing those divine qualities in the world. As we shift into the last part of Little's book, it becomes less about deconstructing old beliefs and more about constructing a new framework for understanding our relationship with the divine. He offers some really practical advice on how we can put these ideas into practice in our daily lives.
I'm all ears after all the thought-provoking concepts we've discussed. I'm ready for some concrete steps we can take. Where does he suggest we begin?
Well, he starts with that fundamental shift in perspective we talked about earlier, moving away from seeing ourselves as simply God's creations to embracing the idea that we are God's children. It's about recognizing that spark of the divine within us and living from that place of inherent goodness.
It's like stepping into our full potential, recognizing that we're not just flawed beings in need of fixing, but expressions of that divine source capable of incredible love, compassion, and understanding.
That's a great way to put it. And when we truly embody that perspective, it naturally influences our actions. If we see ourselves as part of a divine family, it becomes harder to justify treating others with anything less than respect and kindness.
Like those us versus them mentalities that create so much division and conflict just start to crumble when we recognize that we're all ultimately on the same team, sharing the same divine origin.
Exactly. And Little challenges us to look at those areas in our lives where we might still be holding on to judgment prejudice or a sense of separation from others. Those attitudes contradict the idea of a unified spiritual family.
I think we all have those moments where we judge others or feel a sense of superiority. It's hard to completely let go of those ingrained patterns.
It is, but Little suggests that these negative patterns often stem from fear, insecurity, or a lack of understanding. It's like we're afraid of what's different, so we cling to those familiar boundaries and categories that make us feel safe.
That makes sense. Fear can be such a powerful motivator, even if it's subconscious. How does he suggest we overcome that fear and embrace a more inclusive worldview?
He encourages us to step outside our comfort zones and to approach the unknown with curiosity and a willingness to learn. It's about opening our hearts and minds to the possibility that our way of seeing the world might not be the only way or even the best way.
It's about being open to different perspectives and recognizing the value and beauty in diversity.
Exactly, and that's where Little's emphasis on personal growth and experience comes in. He suggests that true understanding doesn't come from blindly accepting doctrines or dogmas, but from engaging with the world around us, learning from our mistakes, and continually expanding our capacity for compassion.
So it's a process of ongoing learning and growth, not about achieving some kind of static state of enlightenment.
It's about becoming more fully human. Which, according to Little, is the same as becoming more fully divine.
That's a beautiful way to frame it. It implies that our spiritual journey is intertwined with our human experience.
Right.
We don't have to transcend our humanity to connect with the divine.
Right.
It's more about embracing our humanity in its fullness.
Exactly. And this connects to another key point he makes about divine inspiration.
Okay.
He suggests that it's not about waiting for some kind of sudden revelation or mystical experience, but rather a gradual unfolding of truth that we become receptive to as we grow and evolve.
It's like we're walking a path that's constantly revealing itself to us one step at a time.
Yeah.
We don't need to see the whole journey laid out before us.
Right.
We just need to trust the process and keep moving forward.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights the importance of both faith and reason in this journey.
Right.
It's not about choosing one over the other, but about finding a balance between the two.
I can see how both are essential. Faith provides us with that sense of hope, purpose, and trust in something greater than ourselves. And reason helps us make sense of the world, discern truth from falsehood, and make wise choices.
I like how you frame that. It's like faith is the fuel that propels us forward, and reason is the compass that guides our direction.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
And as we navigate this journey, Little emphasizes that there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah.
We each have a unique path to follow, shaped by our individual gifts, talents, and experiences.
Yes, and he encourages us to honor those differences, to respect the diversity of human experience, and to recognize that there are many ways to connect with the divine.
Right.
It's not about trying to fit everyone into the same mold, but about celebrating the unique beauty of each individual soul.
That's such a powerful message. It's a call for unity and understanding, a celebration of our shared humanity and our connection to something greater than ourselves.
Exactly. And ultimately, that's what Little's book is all about.
Okay.
It's a call to move beyond those old patterns of division and separation and to create a world that reflects the love and compassion at the heart of our being.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into faith, reason, and the reality of God, what are some key takeaways that our listeners can carry with them? What can they do to put these ideas into practice in their own lives?
Well, I think the book leaves us with both a challenge and an invitation.
Okay.
The challenge is to question those long-held beliefs, those ingrained assumptions about faith, reason, and the reality of God.
Okay.
Be willing to let go of the old maps and to trust our own inner compass.
And the invitation?
The invitation is to embrace our full potential as children of God, to cultivate our capacity for love, compassion, and understanding, and to contribute to the creation of a world that reflects those divine qualities.
It's about taking all that we've learned from this deep dive and putting it into practice in our daily lives.
It's about becoming the change we want to see in the world, one thought, one word, one action at a time.
To close out our discussion, I want to leave you with one final thought-provoking quote from Little. He writes, "It is time for the self-appointed authorities of God to step down from their thrones of division and condemnation. There is only one way for humankind to truly worship God, to embrace all of God's children in love, unconditional love."
What a powerful message. It reminds us that the true measure of our spirituality is not found in our doctrines or beliefs, but in the way we treat one another.
It's a call to move beyond judgment and separation and to embrace a more expansive and compassionate way of being in the world. So as you go about your day, consider the implications of this message and allow it to guide your thoughts, words, and actions.
And remember, the journey of faith, reason, and the reality of God is an ongoing exploration. There's always more to discover, more to understand, and more to love.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll